In a place where, as recently as the mid-20th century, the sea, the heat, and the sand dictated an almost medieval economy, cities with glass towers, world-class airports, and artificial water produced on an industrial scale rose within just a few decades. This is not just urbanization, it is an engineering victory over an environment that, by every rule, should have left behind nothing but poverty, nomadism, and seasonal labor. But to understand how this is even possible, you have to start not with skyscrapers. You have to start with a dune. On December 2nd, 1971, the United Arab Emirates was proclaimed an independent state. 2 months later, on February 10th, 1972, Ras Al Khaimah joined the federation, and the union of the 7 Emirates became complete. But at that moment, no one could guarantee that this new country would hold together at all. Britain was leaving the region, the old security mechanisms were collapsing, and ahead lay a territory where, without water, without a single economy, and without political stability, everything could once again crumble back into sand. The stakes were simple and brutal. Either this country would learn to live in the desert by new rules, or the desert would win again. Even before the Union, this story had already gone through a decisive turning point. In 1958, oil was discovered on Das Island in Abu Dhabi. In 1962, the Emirate made its first export of crude oil. In 1966, Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan became the ruler of Abu Dhabi. This is not just a chain of dates. It is the moment when the poorest stretch of coastline on the Persian Gulf received money, power, and time, 3 resources it had never possessed all at once before. The question was no longer whether wealth would be found here. The question was whether the desert could be kept from turning that wealth into dust. Before oil, people here lived by fishing, pearl diving, and coastal trade. For Dubai and Abu Dhabi, the sea was not a view from the window, but work, risk, and a source of food. The heat made every step physically heavy, water was scarce, and the sand could support neither buildings nor illusions. In places like this, silence during the day does not mean peace, it means exhaustion. When you see a high-rise city in the UAE today, it is easy to forget that not long ago, a fragile coastal economy existed here, tied to a short season, the sea, and luck. And that is exactly why the next fact sounds almost unbelievable. Dubai only began exporting oil in 1969, and the first shipment from the Fateh field amounted to about 180,000 barrels. Against the backdrop of the giants of the oil world, this was not a triumph. It was a chance. Abu Dhabi had the stronger resource base, and it was there that oil money became the foundation for roads, schools, hospitals, and housing. Sheikh Zayed understood one simple thing. If capital appears in the desert, it must not be hidden. It must be turned into infrastructure. Otherwise, it will disappear as quickly as water in an open ditch. And this is where the real magic of the UAE begins. The country did not simply spend oil money. It turned it into a system that could outlive oil itself. The most underrated fact about the UAE is not oil, but water. Today, the country gets most of its drinking water through desalination. Official sources indicate that the UAE operates around 70 major desalination plants, and about 42% of its water needs are covered this way. That means what was built here is not just an urban network. It is a replacement for the natural cycle, and it sounds almost like science fiction. A country in the desert did not find water. It began producing it as an industrial product. Even more astonishing is this: without that water, there would be no towers, no roads, and no very idea of life on this scale. Oil became important not because it was impossible to extract, but because it bought time to build a non-oil economy. In 2024, the UAE's GDP reached 1.776 trillion dirhams, and non-oil sectors accounted for 75.5% of the economy. Trade alone contributed 16.8% of GDP, manufacturing 13.5%, and financial and insurance services 13.2%. This is no longer a country living off a single pipeline. It is a country that forced oil to finance trade, aviation, logistics, tourism, and financial services. That is why, at some point, the UAE stopped being an oil state on the edge of the desert and became a machine that earns money from its position between continents. A country located between Europe, Asia, and Africa began selling not only resources, but also its location on the map. That is why the UAE built airports, ports, free zones, financial centers, and tourism infrastructure with the same stubbornness with which other countries once built factories and railways. This is not just development, it is geography turned into a business model. Imagine Abu Dhabi in the late 1950s. Dust, scattered houses, narrow strips of shade, the smell of the sea and salty wind. And in the ruler's mind, a single question: how do you turn accidental luck into a system? Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan was not a symbol of abstract progress. He was a man who took on the risk of building a state where survival itself seemed like a sufficient task. His wager was simple and brutal. Oil money had to go not to the luxury of the elite, but to the country as a project. And this is where you see the main secret of his success. He did not try to defeat the desert head-on. He built a new logic of life above it. But that decision came at a price. You cannot build roads, schools, hospitals, and housing quickly, while also preserving political stability without a hard concentration of power and resources. You cannot modernize a society quickly and keep it unchanged. You cannot turn fishing settlements into urban civilization without breaking old habits, the old fabric of life, the old hierarchy. That is why there is no safe beauty in this story. Every achievement here was bought by rejecting a previous norm. If stories like this interest you, where geography literally dictates the fate of a country, subscribe to the channel. Here we explore not only beautiful transformations, but places where survival itself becomes a historical event. Because behind the outward shine, there is always a heavy, almost invisible choice. Who gets the water? Where the road will appear? What will be considered normal? And what will be considered luxury? The answer was diversification. Not declarative, but measurable. By 2024, non-oil sectors accounted for 75.5% of the country's GDP, and total GDP had reached 1.776 trillion dirhams. That means oil is no longer the system's only engine. It remains a strategic resource, but no longer the only source of meaning. That is how the UAE turned a geographic limitation into a business model. The desert did not become any less harsh, but the country learned to profit from its ability to connect continents, capital, and flows of people. The main pillars of this model are visible in three sectors: aviation, tourism, and logistics. But two more layers were added, once rarely mentioned in short videos: construction and finance. They are what make growth sustainable rather than decorative. Construction alone contributed 11.7% and real estate 7.8% of non-oil GDP. In other words, the UAE sells not only transit and services, but also the very shape of the city itself. And this is where another astonishing fact appears. While other countries argue over how to conserve water, the UAE already lives in a mode where about 99% of domestic water supply depends on desalinated water. This is not just a technology, it is an entire society's dependence on machines that continuously make everyday life possible. One breakdown and an ordinary shower, a kitchen, a hotel, a hospital, a lawn, a pool, and the whole illusion of natural normality begins to tremble. That is the hidden fragility of a metropolis built in the desert. What matters here is this: the UAE did not cancel the desert. It forced it into submission, but pays for that every single day. The transition to a desert megacity required enormous energy expenditure, while desalination and cooling the urban environment made water and comfort dependent on complex, expensive, and vulnerable infrastructure. After desalination, the water returns to the sea as brine, and the system itself requires a colossal amount of energy. This model has an ecological price, and that price does not disappear just because the economy looks dazzling on a screen.
There is a human cost as well. Rapid wealth changes society faster than people can adapt to it. A city built against the environment still remains hostage to the environment. Only now, it does so with the help of technology, capital, and constant energy consumption. That is why the UAE is not a fairy tale about a miracle. It is a story about how civilization can win against nature tactically, yet never stop paying it.
That is exactly why such a leap is not possible everywhere. The UAE showed a principle more important than oil. In the harshest places, victory belongs not to the one who breaks nature, but to the one who understands its cost and builds a new system on top of it. And perhaps in 20 years, towers will still be standing on that dune. And the answer will be simple. They simply learned not to argue with the desert.
Today, official figures say that about 42% of the UAE's drinking water is supplied by desalination plants, and that the country operates around 70 major stations in total. That means that for millions of people, the tap in the bathroom, the glass of water on the table, and the green grass in the park are the result of specific machines at work, not of a natural cycle. Every shower, every lawn being watered, every hotel pool is not a gift of the climate, but a line in the energy balance. The UAE has no large rivers, no lakes, and its groundwater is limited and depleted faster than it can be replenished. That is why desalination became not a luxury, but a means of survival. It is a quiet but radical change in logic. The country does not search for water, it produces it. It does not wait for rain, it builds stations by the sea. It does not rely on the mercy of nature, it turns nature into part of an engineering problem. But this solution has two shadows. The first is energy. Desalination requires a colossal amount of energy, which means that as long as the economy relies on gas and the remnants of oil, water remains indirectly tied to hydrocarbons. The second is ecological. Salt returned to the sea in the form of brine changes the life of coastal ecosystems. The water inside the city becomes cleaner, while the water off the coast becomes heavier, warmer, and less friendly to living things. And this is where the first question appears, one the UAE will have to answer in this century. Can you build a sustainable civilization if its water does not rise from the ground, but is born on a factory floor?
To understand the scale of the ambition, it is enough to look at a map of Dubai from above. Palm Jumeirah, Palm Jebel Ali, the archipelago of the world. These are not just expensive real estate projects. They are the literal rewriting of the coastline. Palm Jumeirah, for example, added dozens of kilometers of artificial shoreline to the city. Villas, hotels, restaurants, and new economic storylines are built along those lines. But all that beauty stands on millions of cubic meters of sand and stone, dredged and moved for a single idea: to sell an impossible sea view in a place where there was never enough natural coastline to begin with. Projects on that scale alter currents, silt up shallow waters, and affect coral reefs and coastal flora. Scientists and environmental groups have argued for years about whether this is a breakthrough proving what engineering can do, or a carefully disguised ecological disaster. For our story, something else matters. A country that rewrites its shoreline with artificial islands is showing the same principle it applies to water. If natural conditions are not enough, they can be created. If the coast is too short, it can be redrawn. If the desert has no proper outlet to the sea, one can be grown out of sand. But every such project makes geography dependent on constant maintenance. An island has to be reinforced, serviced, protected from storms, subsidence, and time. And the more a country wins against nature, the more expensive it becomes to maintain that victory.
There is another fact that breaks the usual idea of what a state is.
About 89% of the UAE's population consists of non-citizens. Only about 11% are citizens. That means the overwhelming majority of the people who build, service, fill, and animate this country are, in legal terms, temporary.
More than 200 nationalities live in the UAE. The largest groups are people from India and Pakistan, accounting for about 28% and 16% of the population respectively. There are Arab diasporas, Filipinos, Bangladeshis, Europeans, and people from Africa. Each has a different contract, a different term, and a different level of rights. On the streets of Dubai and Abu Dhabi, you can hear dozens of languages in a single hour. Yet the legal structure of this society looks very different from that of a classic nation-state. For our subject, this matters for two reasons. First, because this country depends on a constant inflow of people. Stop that flow, and the cranes will freeze, the hotels will empty out, the services will slow, and part of the economy will begin to contract. Second, because the question, what happens next, sounds different depending on who is asking it. For citizens, it is tied to political and economic stability. For migrants, it is tied to contracts, exchange rates, health, remittances, and the possibility of going home with savings. The combination of a brutally harsh environment, artificial water, and temporary people creates a structure that is fragile but effective. This country lives like a giant infrastructure company, hiring the world to help it hold out in a place where the climate itself offers no chance.
The question of what comes after oil cannot be considered without one number. In 2024, Dubai welcomed about 18.7 million international tourists. That is 9% more than the year before. A city that not long ago was a fishing shore has turned into one of the most visited places on the planet. For many people around the world, Dubai is a set of images. Skyscrapers, shopping malls, fountains, indoor ski slopes, desert safaris in jeeps, hotels with sea views, and artificial islands. But behind each of these images is an economy fundamentally different from the classic equation of country equals oil. The city sells climate control in the desert. It sells the feeling of a miracle, that impossible place where fountains operate in the middle of the sand. It sells the convenience of transit. Many tourists become tourists only because they are changing planes here on the way to a third country. Tourism has become one of the pillars of the non-oil economy. Official strategies aim to raise tourism's contribution to GDP to hundreds of billions of dirhams by 2031. That means the city will continue to double down on exactly this side of itself. Attractions, events, festivals, conferences, exhibitions, everything that turns it from a point on the map into an experience people will pay for. But the more a city becomes an attraction, the harder it is for it to remain simply a place to live. And that leads to the question that has not yet fully been asked. How much tourism can a city absorb before it turns into a backdrop for visitors? One of the rare cases where a state literally writes down what it intends to do with itself over the coming decades is the document called We the UAE 2031. In black and white, it says this: the goal is to double GDP from 1.49 trillion to 3 trillion dirhams by 2031. The plan is to achieve this not by ramping up oil extraction, but through what are called post-oil sectors. The target is to bring non-oil exports to 800 billion dirhams, raise tourism's contribution to 450 billion, and push foreign trade to 4 trillion. This is not a slogan, it is a roadmap. The country is officially stating that its future lies in trade, logistics, services, and technology, not in endlessly expanding oil fields. Today, non-oil sectors already account for about 75% of GDP. The key ones are trade, industry, finance, transport, and construction. That means oil, which once saved this territory from poverty, is gradually becoming one component among many rather than the central axis. But here the dune returns once again, because even the most perfect strategy cannot erase the fact that all of this, trade, finance, tourism, logistics, stands on sand and desalinated water, and on a constant energy supply. The country says, we are ready to live without oil, yet it still depends on infrastructure that consumes energy almost as voraciously as the global economy consumes fuel. Imagine two people you will never see on postcards.
The first is an Emirati citizen born into a family that still remembers the years before oil. For his parents, the word running water once sounded like an impossible promise.
He lives in a state that invests in him. Free education, medical care, social programs, subsidized housing. His passport opens doors to dozens of countries. The second is a worker from South Asia. He lives in a small room shared with several others, works in construction or service, saves money and sends it home. His day begins and ends in an artificial climate. Air conditioning in the room, air conditioning on the bus, air conditioning at the worksite, air conditioning in the shopping mall, where he will never buy anything. For him, the UAE is neither homeland nor dream, but a temporary agreement between the body and the heat, between labor and the contract. Both depend on the same thing, on the fact that this country managed to turn oil into infrastructure, and infrastructure into the possibility of living and working in a place once considered uninhabitable. But the price of participation is different for each of them. For one, the risk is the future of his children in this country. For the other, it is the chance to return home with money and health intact. That is the human side of what is usually called an economic miracle.
When people speak of a miracle in the desert, they rarely add the second half of the phrase. But every miracle comes with a bill. The environmental cost is already visible. Desalination creates problems for the sea. Massive energy consumption increases pressure on a climate that is already getting hotter. Artificial islands disrupt marine ecosystems. Green lawns and parks require water and upkeep that, in this climate, will never become truly natural. The social cost is harder to see on postcards, but it is no less real. A society in which nearly 9 out of 10 people are outsiders lives in a constant state of turnover. People come and go, contracts begin and end, and cities grow faster than stable local communities can form. This is neither good nor bad. It is simply a different norm, one in which home often means not the place where you are, but the place where you send your money. There is also a psychological cost. A city that shows you the achievement of the impossible every day gets used to the speed of miracles, to the idea that something even taller, larger, and faster can always be built. But at some point, the miracle stops being surprising. It becomes the background. And then the question appears: what happens to a city if one day it stops growing?
And this is where the dune returns to our story for the third time. A dune is not just a pile of sand. It is a shape the wind sculpts out of chaos. Today it is one thing, tomorrow another. It promises no stability. It promises movement. The UAE built its strategy as if it understood that principle. It did not wait for stability. It decided to reshape the form of its state every day, out of oil, water, trade, people, and technology. It accepted that the environment would work against it, and treated that as nothing more than part of the problem to solve. You can argue about the price, the ecology, the social structure, and the dependence on energy and the outside world. Those are honest questions. But the fact remains, on a narrow strip between sea and desert, a country emerged that rewrote its own starting conditions. And perhaps in 30 years, we will look at that dune again. Perhaps towers, desalination plants, and ports will still be standing around it. Perhaps the economy will have finally moved beyond oil and will live on trade, knowledge, and services. And then the answer to the question, how did they do it, will turn out to be very simple. They simply learned to rebuild the world on top of sand every single day, and not to argue with the desert, but to treat it as their harshest and most honest partner.